I'll talk about both my books, mostly August Gale. And how many have read the book? I think just, okay, we got 3. All right, so, and I'll save plenty of time for questions after, but this book, I'd been a journalist for 25 years, and I used to write long stories, very long. My editors would cut them, and I finally thought, I need to write books. And so I was watching the movie The Perfect Storm, and that really resonated with me because I have Irish background, ancestry, and I love the sea. And I sat in the theater after that movie and thought, I can do that. I can do this. So about a year or so later, I was talking to my dad in my home in Maine, and I said, Dad, I want to write books. And he said, what kind? And I said, sort of like The Perfect Storm. And he said, you have a story like that in your family. And he had never told this to anyone. His mother, my Nana, had told him the story 40 years earlier, and he just never passed it along to anyone until this night. So on this evening, as the foghorns, echoing outside in the woods, my dad starts to tell me about the August Gale, and all he knows is that our ancestors from Newfoundland were out to sea when this hurricane came in, and that many of them had died. And he knew potentially Captain Patty, who's on the cover, who is my great uncle, was lashed to the rigging, but he really didn't know much more than that. So I was just like, wow, this is fascinating. And so then he says, well, maybe we can get in touch with family. And I'm like, family? Because my dad's father, Ambrose, who is Patty's younger brother, abandoned my dad and my Nana and my uncle, not once but twice. So growing up, when I would say, Nana, where's Grandpa? And she'd say, he's dead. I was 18 before I learned my grandfather was alive in California with another family. But all my, most of my childhood and my teenage years, my father would not speak about Ambrose. If anybody mentioned Ambrose's name, my dad left the room. He didn't want to talk about him. So on this night, my father is saying, maybe we can get in touch with family. And I'm just like, wow. So this begins the story of August Gale. And I was working full-time as a journalist in Portland. I had a daughter who was a year, another daughter who was 3.5. So I didn't have a lot of time. And so my dad starts researching. So my father is not very good with the computer. He's getting better. But his 2 fingers and every other word is Jesus Christ, because he's messing up. And so he starts researching, and my Uncle Bill, who's 10 years younger than my dad, a little bit more computer savvy, Googles August Gale. He comes up with Jamie Walsh, who was born the night of the August Gale. So she, emails my father and says, we've known about you and your brother, we've heard about you, and she starts sharing stories about the August Gale. So my father starts learning all these things, and he's sharing it with me, and I'm saying, Dad, that can't be true. That's just too crazy. I mean, it's just almost like fiction. And so we both start researching. All of a sudden, he gets another email. It's from Ambrose's daughter from California. And this email starts off with, my sister and I have always wanted to meet you and your brother Billy. It's been a lifelong wish of ours, and we are sorry for what our father did. And please know that you are loved, and it's okay if you don't write back. So my father shares this email with me in my Cape Elizabeth home, and I'm thinking, there's no way he's going to write Ambrose's daughter back. Well, he says, what the hell? She didn't do anything. So he emails Donnie back. So pretty soon, Donnie and Kathy are emailing my father. Then they're on the phone. Then my father says, I invited them to my home in New Hampshire for 2 weeks. And so we're all like, what? So I have 5 sisters. We're all on the phone saying, did you hear what Dad did? He invited Ambrose's daughters to their house for 2 weeks. And we're like, what's going on here? And so August Gale starts opening up all these stories, not only about this storm, but about Ambrose and his family. He had 4 sons and 2 daughters in California. So along with researching Ambrose, my main concern was I want to focus on August Gale. I did not want to write about my grandfather because I figured it was going to be too painful, too difficult. I mean, I've done a lot of hard stories in my journalism career, but I wanted nothing to do with a story my father refused to talk about most of his life. But it was like my grandfather kept pushing in. So finally I called my dad and said, Dad, I have to write about Ambrose too. And he said, it's okay, I trust you. And I thought, oh God, I'm a journalist, I'm gonna have to tell the truth. So then my sister Joni, who's one of the twins, my dad had 4 daughters and then two twins with 2 girls. So he finally said, that's it, I'm done. But Joni said, Dad, I want to go to Newfoundland to learn about our ancestors. And he says, well, have a nice trip. He's not going. He wants nothing to do with going to Newfoundland, where Ambrose is from. But then I said, Dad, we have to research the August Gale. And he says, okay. But reluctantly, in June of 2003, we're in a small plane. It's sort of like a lawnmower with an engine, heading to Newfoundland. And, by this time, we had done research and we knew a lot about the story. And we were going there to interview people whose fathers were out in the Gale. And as Newfoundland comes into view, most of the plane ride, my dad had been sighing. He didn't, if he could turn that plane around, he would have. And as the rock came into view, I was just overwhelmed because it was just all of a sudden, we're going to be in Newfoundland where the storm happened and my grandfather was born. And I turned to my dad and I said, did you ever think you'd be going to Newfoundland? And he said, not in a million years. And of course I start, tearing up. And my sister Joni, who's behind me on the plane, I'm looking at her thinking, this is your fault. It's if this is ugly, it's going to be on you. And, so we land, but we were there about 5 days. And Marystown now is about a community of 6,000. At the time of the storm, it was about 300. It was divided by the bay. So where Captain Patty and all the Walshes and the Irish fishermen lived, it was a community of 300. So we start running around interviewing all these children who lost their fathers. Out of a community of 300, 42 children were left without their dads. Mm-hmm. So anyone who remembered the Gale, we were running around, sons, daughters who had fathers out in the storm, we were interviewing. And Newfoundlanders are like the Irish. It's a very Irish community. They talk fast. You can't understand them. And most of the people we're interviewing were older, so they were deaf. So there was a lot of shouting going on, a lot of charades, we're like, what? And they'd say it again, and we're like, did you get that? But the stories were very powerful. And Captain Patty, who was my great uncle, I don't know if you can see the picture of his face, but he was he didn't fear anything on land or sea. And Captain Patty was known as a highliner, meaning he came back with more cod than anyone, and his schooner would, be so weighted down, it would be below the high water mark. And so he would come home, everybody wanted to crew for him. But Patty, during storms, all the Irish Catholic fishermen, they're very religious, they would bring their holy, rosary beads, the holy water, the palm fronds, and when the waves would rise, they would throw these things into the sea and say, Jesus, Mary, calm the waters. And Patty would climb to the top of the rigging during a gale and shout to God, I'm not afraid of you. And so all the other fishermen are like, get down, Patty, come on. We don't need that right now. But so Patty, he'd fight. There was no one he wouldn't take on. But he was well respected. So during this August journey, it was the beginning of hurricane season, and the August gales had killed hundreds of men before. The storms would come up, and this is back when the schooners, they had nothing but the barometer, the glass, that told them, the pressure's dropping, a storm is coming. That and their sense of the sea. So during this August journey, it's not only Patty going out. On his schooner, the Annie Anita, every summer, he took his 2 sons. Frankie, on this journey, is 12. He hates the sea. He gets seasick, but he's Captain Patty's son, so he has to go. Jerome is 14. Jerome loves to go out to sea, loves to fish. So he's got 12-year-old Frankie, 14-year-old Jerome, and a crew of 6 other men from Marystown. On another schooner is Patty's eldest son, James. James is 21. He's never captained a schooner before, and he's going to be captaining a schooner, the Mary Bernice, with 4 men. And his wife is ready to give birth. So on this journey, Patty's wife, Lillian, and again, very Irish, all the women were very superstitious. Most fishermen wives are, for good reason. So you wouldn't wave goodbye to your man because you'd conjure a wave. You wouldn't turn a cake pan over when they're out to sea because for fear of turning your man's schooner or dory over. They wouldn't do anything. But on this journey, just before Patty's going off, he and Lily are having a cup of tea, and they're sitting there, and a whirlwind just kicks up and throws dirt at the window just outside where, their house. And she's convinced. She says, Patty, don't go. And he says, okay, Lily, and I won't go tonight, because it was the anniversary of their daughter, Mary Bernice, had died of illness. And that was the name of James Schooner. So she was convinced. She said, don't, it's a bad omen. So they go out, and she sees one dark cloud in the sky, and she begs him, don't go, Patty. And he says, Lil, I'll sail tomorrow. It's okay, I'll sail in daylight. And he said, there's a clear sky. So of course, all the fishermen's wives, their family members, had feelings during this journey. They didn't want them to go. Patty's other friend in the community was Father McGettigan. And Father McGettigan also was quite the character. He ruled that community. He was a fighter. Anytime they'd have the garden parties, all the rum was out there. McGettigan would see a fight, he'd take his collar off and say, all right, over here, next. So he was also quite the character, but he was also Patty's friend, because the two of them would play cards, they'd have rum. And Patty's second hand, Tom Reed, was the second mate, in charge whenever Patty was off the schooner. He and Patty would fight. They had a moonshine in the woods. They'd fight about anything, nets, how to, dory fish. But when Patty was on that schooner, Tom Reed respected him. He didn't mess with Patty. So on this journey, Tom Reed was Patty's second hand with the crew. So they're going off, and of course it was a beautiful day that morning. And I don't want to give away too many things in the book, because there's
I'm ready to read.
the scene about the wake, which is one of my favorites, and I am hoping it becomes a movie. There's just so many scenes in this book that you can't imagine are real. And so on this journey, for me as a journalist, all the stories in the book are true. And after interviewing all these people in Newfoundland, I went twice back to visit and to interview more and to get anything I could from these people. Because one of the pieces, I don't want to give away too much, but Patty was out to sea, and we couldn't figure out why he wasn't on that schooner, because, he's the captain. But, one of the doryman's daughters said, well, I know why he wasn't on the schooner. A skipper who was coming in, they called the storm the Divil. It was like a devil danced on the water. The dory, men were out in the dory, it was a clear sky, but they started noticing the buoys were shooting up and then going down and shooting up. The anchor was twirling. There was a current under the sea, and the veteran dorymen said, we've got to get out of here. There's something bad coming. And so they all, out in these dories, they would have to row 1.5 miles out to where they're setting their trawls. And then they'd set 1,500 hooks, and then they'd go back to the schooner and back again. So these men, had to pull their lines and row, 1.5 miles back to the schooner. So as the storm is kicking up, one of the skippers saw Patty out in a dory, and this is when the storm is starting to hit, and it's getting crazy. And, the skipper says to Patty, he knew him, Patty, what are you doing? There's a divil coming. And Patty said, I know, but I have a stray dory. And again, I don't know for sure who that dory was, but Patty's son Jerome loved to fish. And in my mind, Patty's not going back to that schooner till he finds his son Jerome. Meanwhile, Frankie is left on the schooner, and Frankie is fearful enough on a calm day, but as the waves are rising, the fishermen used to dress to meet God. So little Frankie put on a Sunday suit, and Tom Reed, who is the one on the schooner left behind to watch Frankie, says to Frankie, go below and start praying. So Frankie is just clutching a Bible as the storm is coming in, and he's wearing a suit to meet God. And I won't tell you what happens, but I know, it's like, but Frankie, and again, all of this is, and I won't give away the wake scene either, but Tom Reed was left, and he was also a fisherman that used to get seasick. But there was another piece, for this book, I interviewed 200 people, not only my relatives about Ambrose, but I interviewed fishermen, anyone who remembered anything about the storm. I spent time with a curator from Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. I had found his name on Sable Island, and the writer credited him for helping. So of course I called this guy up and said, oh, I'm researching this book, and he says, I should have hung up on you, because it was a March day, and the wind's blowing, and the doors are blowing open from the museum, and tourists are trying to get in, and I call, and he says, bad omen, I should have just, because for a year, for every week, I called him up, and I would ask him questions, and he gave me an education in the fisheries, because I knew nothing. He said, Barbara, it's a line, not a rope. It's a tub, not a bucket. It's a ship, not a boat. And he read every chapter and said, nope, can't use that word. And I'd be like, come on. But he was wonderful. And there were two fishermen in Lunenburg. I actually went up and drove them crazy in person. But there were two fishermen who were from Newfoundland. I went on their schooners. I rode a dory with them. Of course, they made fun of me. I had dogfish strokes. And I said, whatever, I'm learning. But they read my chapters, and they were fabulous because they had me sailing Patty to Africa. They said, Barbara, he's going the wrong way there. And I said, okay, I'll change the direction. But then I contacted a hurricane expert to recreate that storm as it came up, because this storm was supposed to go up and then northeast, go off to the Grand Banks. Well, this storm connected with a low pressure system from Nova Scotia, which made it a monster, and it went straight for Newfoundland. So all these fishermen were just right, smack center of the gale. And back then, they didn't really know the waves, how high were they? It was sort of an estimate. We interviewed fishermen that were out in the gale, and one of them, of course, he was deaf and in his 80s, but his name was Jim Pad Kelly. Jim Pad was a legend. He would go out in the dories, and oftentimes these fishermen, the fog would come in. They couldn't find their way back to the schooner. So Jim Pad Kelly had gotten lost twice previously before, and he rode 7 days back from the Grand Banks to Marystown. And during one of these occasions, it was cold. It was the start of winter, and his dory mate. There was always two men in the dory. They're 15-foot dories and filled with cod. So his dory mate finally says, I can't continue. And Jim Pad's, well, give me your damn mitts, because I'm not dying yet. He'd lost his mittens. He said, well, give me them. And he made it back. But during our interview with Jim Pad, we said, what were the waves like? And when this storm came in, Jim Pad Kelly was 18. His dory mate was Bill Hanrahan. He was 17. Bill had never been out to sea before. He never went back. During the gale, they managed to row back to the schooner. They get on board, and they're tied to the rigging, because otherwise you'd just be swept off. So Jim Pad and his dory mate are tied to the rigging, and all of a sudden, they look and they see a wave that is a mountain. And the 17-year-old Jim Pad, who was mischievous, says, hey, look at that wave. And this dory mate just said, my heart moved, and he never went back to sea again. But these men made it home. Very few of the, unfortunately, people from the community made it back. But it was, again, the women in the community. It was 1935, so the dirty 30s. All of these people barely survived when their husband brought home the cod. And now, as the winter's coming, the women also were very courageous, because they were left with all these children. They could barely, a lot of the kids went to the orphanage. Some of the kids were given to other families because the women just couldn't feed them. But the other piece of this book, initially, once I said, okay, I'm telling my family story too, I was like, how do I tell this story? It's about a real storm and the family storm that my grandfather stirred up. And I began to see a lot of similarities, just like the women of the August Gale. They always thought their husbands were coming back. They just thought, well, somehow maybe he's going to return. My Nana always thought Ambrose was coming back, despite the fact he was in California. And then my father, just like the August Gale children, who their lives were forever changed after that storm. My father's life was changed after Ambrose abandoned them twice. And so I began to see, these parallel stories. So the book alternates in time between, the storm and the storm he created. But I'm just going to read a couple passages, and this scene takes place as the gale is striking. And again, I mentioned Tom Reed was the one that was left on the schooner to look out for Frankie while the other men were trying to get back. Reed cranked the schooner horn again and again, calling his men home. The haunting bellows beckoned in the dark. "Where the hell you at, Patty?" Reed whispered. Hundreds of strokes from the Annie Anita, Patty rode in the dark, his kerosene torch lighting a small patch of the sea. The dory rode up and down on the rolling waves. Foam spewed in spindrifts, circling the boat like spirits. The white horses, waves that curled and crested like a horse's mane, pounded the dory's bow. As Patty's dory mate, John Brinton, bailed, the skipper struggled to keep the boat from turning crossways in the sea. The combers were almost as tall as the 15-foot dory, and she rose up with them and crashed into their troughs with a teeth-jarring jolt. Blood trickled from Patty's hands as he gripped the oars and heaved his chest into every stroke. The skipper knew there was little time left to find Jerome and get back to the schooner. There was little time left for them all. In the distance, Patty could see a half-dozen vessels racing for shore, their lights blazing on the bow and stern. A schooner hove to the wind drew closer to Patty's dory. As the vessel sailed within shouting distance, the captain hollered over the rail, offering to hoist Patty and his dory on board. Patty recognized the skipper, a fisherman from Trepassey. "Patty, you've got to get in," the captain shouted. "There's a divil coming." "I know," Patty bellowed. "We'd be gone in now, boy, but we've got a stray dory." The Trepassey skipper nodded, bid the Marystown captain good luck and God's blessing, before pointing his schooner toward shore. Patty pulled harder on the oars, his eyes blinded by rain that lashed from a sky black as coal. Waves crested and broke, one after another, slamming the dory onto her sides. Patty cursed the wind, the waves, and the gale that threatened to kill them all. He turned to the heavens and shouted, "Take me, you son of a bitch. Just spare me, boys." The captain's mind raced, wild with worry. He imagined Jerome, terrified, in a dory that pitched and rolled. The lad would be weeping, crying for the comfort of his mother and a warm bed at home. "Jesus, Jerome, don't fret, lad. The doryman will get you back to the schooner. We'll get out of this then. We'll pull the anchor and sail into Trepassey. You'll be okay, boy. Hang on to the gunwales. Don't let the seas wash you overboard. Hold fast. You'll be home at your mother's side soon." Patty hoped the doryman who took Jerome out had taken notice of the changes in the tide early. If they'd pulled their trawl at the first hint of the gale, they'd still have a chance to get on board the Annie Anita. Reed would be looking out for them. He'd keep the foghorn blowing, the lights bright. He'd keep the schooner steady and Frankie comforted until he returned. And James, was he keeping Mary Bernice hove into the wind? Was he at the helm? Head out to sea, James. Get away from the sunkers and the shoal water, son. The waves there will rise up from the bottom of the sea and pound the vessel to bits with the force of a freight train. Lash yourself to the wheel when the gale hits. When it gets dirty and dark, you won't be able to stand in the fearsome wind. And then the waves will come, one after another, combers that look like mountains. Keep her steady. Take the waves as best you can. Don't let them hit you broadside. The vessel shall never right herself. With the blow it'll strike her. Ride with the storm, James. Keep your wits about you and ride her out. You're a captain now, son. Bring your crew home. I'll see you on Marystown shores. We'll have plenty of yarns to share about your first August gale, me boy. You will be telling stories until your grandchildren tumble beneath your feet. So, I know. I won't tell you how that ends. Yeah, well, but again,
And it's true.
it is. Patty, again, that scene, I obviously wasn't in the dory with him. One of my sisters thought we should have a seance and conjure up Patty, and I said, no, I'm good with conjuring up Patty. I don't know if I want him in my life. But obviously that scene, that Trepassey skipper was able to tell us, because no one could figure out why Patty wasn't back on the schooner. And that was the piece But things like the night before the gale hit, I went on a radio show in Newfoundland during one of my visits, talk radio. Canadians love their radio, and my relatives, the Brentons, who are wonderful, they said, get on talk radio. And I'm like, no, I'm not doing that. So they dialed it up, gave me a glass of wine, shut the door. They said, get in there, you're on in 5 minutes. And so, of course, I went on radio and said, anyone with information about the August Gale or Captain Patty, my great uncle, or the men from Marystown, please call. Well, within, 10 minutes, we had a bunch of people calling. The night before the gale, there was two young brothers who were on a beach. Patty and his 2 sons were rowing the dory to get fresh water. And they hit the sand, and the 2 boys are off, Jerome and Frankie. And it's a beautiful night, and there are 2 black labs on the beach. So they're throwing sticks to the boys and, having fun with the dogs. And then, of course, one of the brothers says, well, you can take one of the dogs on the schooner. And Patty always had dogs. And the boys are like, great, Dad, can we? And he said, all right. So the lab bounds into the dory, and the last view this young boy has at the time is a beautiful sunset, his lab in the dory with these 2 boys who are just so happy to have this dog. And he, again, I won't give too much away, but I know, so the mothers are getting sad here, but but the amazing thing is I was able to piece together so many stories like that and recreate the scenes in this book. And the wake, which is one of my favorite chapters, and it's, it's typical Irish wake, but some things happened at this wake that were very different. And again, I won't spoil it. But when I first learned it from my dad, I said, that's not true, Dad, that can't be true. And it is. And people go to Marystown just to visit the cemetery because of this story. But anyway, one final passage I'll read, and it's a shorter one, is about the scene with my dad interviewing one of the children who lost his father in the gale. And
Did you meet some of them yourself?
oh yeah, no, we interviewed several of these people. And this is one of those interviews. And of course, again, we were kind of shouting and saying, what? But, I'll save time for questions. And I will briefly talk about Sammy too. But again, let your people know I am trying to get this made into a movie. Anyone's got those connections? We need to get this going. You can all be fishermen or fishwives. We'll get you out there. Hang on, let me find my passage here. So again, this is with our first trip to Newfoundland. Winding past the cluster of houses along Reed Hill, we look for the home of Michael Farrell, whose father crewed for James Walsh on the Mary Bernice. A short distance from Patty's home, we spot the small white house that sits along the bay. A bachelor who lives alone, Farrell has been waiting for our arrival. A thin, dark-haired man, he welcomes us from his doorstep. God bless ye, come in, he hollers. Cats, nearly a dozen of them, roam the yard. A few scurry inside the house. Not fond of felines, Joni, my sister, heads back to the car, explaining that she will pick us up later. My father and I follow Farrell inside, where he pulls kitchen chairs out for us. In the dimly lit room, Farrell begins to talk. The words tumble from his mouth quickly. He is excited to share his stories, but his Newfoundland accent is thick, almost incomprehensible. I glance at my father's eyes, and I know he is thinking, oh, brother. Still, Farrell has something to say, and we want to understand him. Our conversation evolves into an odd charade. Farrell speaks a few sentences, and my father and I try to select words that we recognize and repeat them back. This goes on for 10 minutes before we figure out that Farrell was a year old at the time of the storm. He had 3 older siblings, and his mother's name was Victoria. Farrell begins to talk about the night of the gale, and my father and I lean forward. The wind, Farrell tells us, repeating the word again before we have the chance to do so. The wind was fierce that night. My gosh, the old people thought the roof was going to blow off. Farrell says something about his mother, explaining that she saw a token. Token? My father and I ask, unfamiliar with this word, that what we'll later learn means a vision, a portent of death. Ignoring our question, Farrell continues his story, and we discern the words hallway and boots. We utter the words back to him, and Farrell patiently tells us the story again, this time slowly. The night of the gale, his mother heard noises in her second-floor hallway. Me mother could hear someone walking in the hall, he tells us. She got up from her bed and saw me father in his oilskins and boots. He was walking back and forth. Your mother saw his spirit, I ask? Farrell nods. She kept shouting his name, but he would not answer. He just kept pacing the floorboards. She knew then my poor daddy was lost. Barely a toddler at the time of the gale, Farrell has no memory of the father he was named after. He cannot recall his father's voice, his face, his dad's large, callous hands. All I knew when I was a boy was that my poor daddy was lost, drowned, gone forever. I used to feel terrible about it. I wished I knew what happened, how he went. Farrell falls silent, and my father and I are quiet too. From the window, I see Joni pull into the driveway. Knowing we have garnered as much as possible from Farrell, I stand telling him, "Thanks for talking with us. I am sorry about your father." He shakes our hands, appreciative that we listen to his stories. As we head out the door, he bids us another, "God bless ye." I smile at Farrell and return his blessing. My father, who like Joni is not fond of cats, walks quickly to the car. Farrell continues to wave goodbye, and I sense his sadness, a son lonely for his father. 68 years after the gale, his sorrow lingers. His words echo in my head. All I knew was that my poor daddy was lost. I follow my father's footsteps, taking in the sight of his back, the broad shoulders that have carried his own loss for much of his life. As he slips into the passenger seat, I wonder which is worse, to have no memories of your dad before he vanishes in a roiling sea, or to be deserted on a cold November night by a father who is your hero, your idol, for the first 11 years of your life. I know. See, I usually start crying there. I usually start cracking. Oh, we need tears in aisle 2. There are uplifting points in this book, though. The end is, yes, there. It's, but it's in many ways it's a story about family and also courage of the people who carried on. And my father, for 9 years, as I wrote and researched this book, I dreaded having my father read this because I said, "Dad, you can read the Newfoundland chapters, but you can't read the Ambrose chapters." So I would send him chapters 1, 3, 5, 7. He's like, "What's going on?" I said, "You're not going to read the Ambrose chapters." I would never finish the book because it was too emotional. So when my rough draft was done, I told my publisher, I'm going to send it to my dad and my uncle. If there's anything they don't feel okay about, I'm going to have to take it out. So I sent this book in March 2011 to my dad. I knew he would sit on the couch and not move. He's an avid reader. So he got it about noon, and I had my older sister, Diane. I said, "Call him, see how he's doing." She called him, he was halfway through. She says, "He loves it." And I'm like, "Oh my God, thank God." So he calls me at 5 and he says, "I can't believe what you did." And of course, he said, "Well, you got to get Aunt Ruth in there because she'll be rolling over in a grave." And Uncle Tommy.
Oh, that's funny.
Because they helped my dad, my uncle, and Nana when they came back from California after the second desertion by Ambrose. They were penniless. They were shamed. Aunt Ruth took them in. Uncle Tommy helped them. So I said, "Dad, that's it? 9 years? I worried, and that's it?" And he said, "That's it." And my dad now is my biggest, if you go on my website, my dad has handed out 1,500 bookmarks. Anywhere he goes, the golf course, the pizza parlor, the gas station. He was in vacation in St. Augustine's. He would chase people down the street. "Do you like to read?" And I get sometimes 3 phone calls a day. "I got another one. They're in a book club." And he is incredible. So he's become my biggest fan. So it's ironic that a story he never talked about for most of his life, he is now spreading the word to anyone that comes near him. But he's my family's wonderful. But it's really been an incredible book because Ambrose's daughters not only became friendly with our family, 2 of Ambrose's sons contacted me after the book, and I had no idea what they would think. But one of them said, "Your book helped me understand my father." So it's been, the people in Marystown love it, thankfully. I've not received any negativity, which is wonderful. And again, book clubs are loving it. And I think men enjoy it for the sea drama and Cat and Patty, and women like the memoir. So it's kind of gender, neutral friendly with genders. And so it's been a fabulous story after the book came out too. But anyway, I'll be quiet. But I'll just briefly talk about Sammy, and then I'll open it up for questions, if I can just steal that without stepping on this. But many of you, this is my children's book, and I've been a journalist, 25 years. Never had a book come out. This came out August 2011. August Gale came out October 2011. So it was a little crazy. But Sammy in the Sky is also a true story, and it's based on the death of our dog Sam. My daughters, Emma and Nora. Emma was 5, and as you can see, she loves Sammy. Sammy was her best buddy. And when Sammy turned 12, we learned Sammy had a bump. And, Emma was, Sammy would play house. She'd dress him up. She'd play school. So he was her best friend. And we learned, he kept her safe at night. But we learned, Sammy had cancer. And he used to love chasing bubbles and doing the Sammy dance. He'd throw his paws in the air on his back. But then, as you can see, Jamie's illustrations are stunning with the dog. So, I wrote this story, and my daughter, Sammy used to love one of the images too. Sorry, I have to find this one because it's about things like my daughter Nora. Sorry, it's towards the end. But Sammy did die, and as a journalist, I kept writing things down. My daughter Nora, who is the feistier, the Irish lass in the family, she would point to heaven and say, "Sammy, you come down here," and say things like, "Maybe if Daddy gets a really tall ladder, he can go get Sammy." So as a journalist, I kept writing these things down, and I realized there weren't many books out about death that was realistic. And my daughters used to always look to the sky, and they'd find Sammy up there. And they'd, finally, my daughter Emma, who was, really sad, and would say, "Why can't he come back?" And I say, "You have to remember him." She would find Sammy and say, "You're still the best hound dog in the whole wide world." So Jamie Wyeth, I ended up, agents originally said, "No, the story's too sad, it's too real, it won't sell." And then I was like, okay. And I told my daughters, this book will be in a bookstore one day, because librarians, school teachers read the story, and they said, "Barbara, there's nothing like this out there. We need this book." So then a friend said, "Call Jamie Wyeth." I said, "Yeah, sure." And, being a journalist, I've called many people. I've talked to, all kinds of people. So I called him, and he answered the phone, which I wasn't expecting. I said, "Jamie?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Barbara here. I have a story I'd like you to read." So I sent him my Sammy in the Sky story. And the first ending was true. We had Sammy cremated. And the ashes, we decided to spread them in the field where Sammy ran. Well, it was a windy day, and they blew back on Nora. So she was a little ghost. So my first version of the book, it ended that way. And I thought, my friends were like, "That's kind of morbid." So I rewrote it and said, all right, they're always seeing Sammy in the clouds. So I sent that second version to Jamie. On my way back from Newfoundland, I was in Toronto, and my husband had called and said, "I'll be home." He said, "Don't kill me," but I had to open this envelope from Jamie Wyeth. It had a Wolfman and Frankenstein stamps, and Jamie said, "I love the story, second version better. Do you want color or black and white illustrations?" So, he, it began this journey. This book came out August 2011. Our first signing was at the Farnsworth Museum. It was a rainy day. I think 1,000 people showed up. We sold 750 books. People waited in line 2.5 hours. And this quickly sold 10,000 copies. And it's now in its 4th printing. And it's a great book for kids who lose a pet or a person. School teachers love it for the classroom. And sometimes, grandmothers just keep it on hand. So it was another lesson for me and my daughters, don't listen to people who tell you you can't, make your dreams happen. And I need to get going on some other books.
Yes.
But anyway,
you can't run around like this.
I know, but I'll open it up to questions now that I've, but any thoughts? Sorry, back here.
Hi, you answered my first question. That was
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Secondly, I just admire so much how your single idea just opened up so much for your family as well as for you. It's just amazing. It's an amazing story.
In the August Gale.
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting because I do a lot of book clubs. I Skype into clubs or I go visit them if they're close. But I was just at a book club Wednesday, and people often say to me, "You've given your father such a gift with this book," and my father has begun, talking, because if he was here today and you asked him questions, he would talk, and he has told stories he's never told before, and it's letting go of some of the bitterness. And I think it's been great for him and my uncle. But in many ways, I feel it was a gift for me. My father would have never told this story to anyone but me. So he did trust me. So I feel it was a mutual thing. But we travel a lot together. We do talks, and he'll Skype too. So we can get him Skyping. But
I have a comment about it. When I first started reading the book, I read it because you were coming, and I like to be informed when I come to Bill very much. But as I got into it, it's so much more than a story of a storm.
Right.
And I've read storm stories before, and you get caught up in it and you want to know what happens and all that. But this is so much more because it's more than a story of a storm. It's a story of a family and a story of the storm in the family, which gives so much hope. I mean, it's sad in many ways, but it also, I came away from reading that book feeling like there was great joy in it.
Right.
And I think that made it really more than just a story about a storm.
Right.
And I think your gift is a gift to us because we know
Oh, you're sweet. Oh, that's nice. You make me cry. But it's funny because I tell people, that family stories, like I didn't even know I had relatives in Newfoundland. I didn't even know where Newfoundland was. I was like, where is that? But I tell people, record your stories even if it's just for your family, because the past is who we are. I mean, my grandfather, he talked with his hands. As you can see, I have to sit on mine. But I mean, my grandfather, and he always knew. I mean, after I won the Pulitzer, my Nana would still write him and send him stories. And he said, I wonder if my grandfather will come find me. And I did, long after he died. I mean, my grandfather was dead when I started doing this book. But I felt like I was meant to do this book. I was meant to tell this story for many reasons. But I have no doubt in my mind that I was just supposed to do this. And but I thank you, because I tell people, families are messy. We all have stories, but it's who we are. And so I encourage children and adults, write your stories down, even if it's just for a scrapbook. But sorry, you had.
I think it would make a wonderful movie.
Well, get you in it. You're going to be you could be one of the fishwives. Yeah.
You mentioned that, I wanted to ask you mentioned that something about your agent when you had the Sammy book. Did you have an agent before the book?
No, I typically you get an agent kind of when you're working on books, and she was wonderful. In fact, she lives, Diane Freed, she's has a home in Boothbay, and she's a wonderful lady. But she was my agent on both. But I am, with the movie, you need someone to get behind the book. I'm not going to write the screenplay. It's not what I do. So I need one of those people that come to Maine that's, one of those actors, one of those producers. So if anybody has connections, we'll get you all in there.
Well, it's so hard to find an agent. I just wondered how you got it.
Typically, I found it through another writer, and agents have to be open to new clients. But it's, you would send your story synopsis to an agent and try to, share what you know about the story and how you would tell it. And you'd have to pitch it. You kind of sell your story to that agent, too, and sell who you are. Oh, good. But any questions or?
What was your agent's name?
Diane, she just retired. Sorry, she just retired. Sorry. But if you could go on the Maine Writers and Publishers website, and they're a wonderful source for writers.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
I had an agent, but she retired. That's why.
Yeah.
It's really two stories.
Right.
And a lot of people read 1-3, did exactly what your father did, 1-3-5-7.
Yep.
And then read one of the people that I
Really?
said, you gotta buy this book. She said, I started, then I had to do it the other way because I had to know. So that's what she did.
Oh, she's funny.
No, she read 1-3-5.
Right. No, and I've never heard people. So she was just reading certain chapters and then going back.
No, what she did was she read the whole story of Patty, and
Yep.
then she read the whole story of your father in Ambrose.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because you kept them separate.
But I felt like they connected to each other,
Well,
though.
I think they
Yeah.
connected too.
Yeah.
I couldn't have done that, but she really
No, that's interesting, yeah. I didn't, you know,
It would be a super movie.
I know, we've got to get the movie made.
I do have a name for you.
Oh, good. Oh, good, great. See, we got the movie done. All right, we'll film it in Boothbay, right?
Will you?
Yeah. But any,
There probably are stories just like it in Boothbay.
all right.
Have you been over to the Dory?
No, I haven't. I'll have to check that out. But any other questions or, all right, sorry.
There's actually a long history of serious storms in that area.
Right,
Some of my kin folks are on a schooner that's northeast of Prince Edward Island.
Right.
In the late 1800s.
yep,
They were driven ashore on the Madeline Islands.
right, yep.
They had to take an axe and cut down the mast.
Right, so they wouldn't, yeah, yep,
And then at an earlier time, there were lots of greenlands in this area.
yep,
And the first Greenland to come in was Edmund Greenland came into Newbury in 1638.
mm-hmm,
And he had a son named Stephen, another son named Stephen, and another named Stephen.
yeah,
One of these Stephens, Stephen Greenland, is recorded in the death records in Newbury, Massachusetts.
yeah,
Stephen Greenland and all hands lost at Caberdoon.
huh,
It was spelled Cabradoon.
Oh.
It was in Africa.
Huh.
Caberdoon.
huh.
Took me a long time to figure out it was Cape Breton.
Wow, wow. Oh, that's interesting, huh? And the penmanship probably was, yeah,
He spelled differently back.
yeah.
Now, you named it August Gale, is it, are there gales every August, so that they just talk about it, or was it just this one?
No, there were many gales, but the August gale, they were very concerned at the beginning of the storm season because, thousands. I mean, there were August gales of 27, 35. There was an August gale in 1800s that killed, a lot of men from all over, and even Boston, So when I was researching, people would say, oh, my ancestors were lost in the 27 gale. I'm like, no, I'm focusing on the 35. But the gales were very common, and a lot of men were lost.
Did that have any connection with the hurricane of 38 that went through this area, main area?
I'm sure by the time it went up there, I didn't really find much on that, but not really a connection. Right, right. This was 1935. Yeah. Okay. The 38. Oh, thank. You're all good. But I have plenty of copies, and Sherman's books, I have copies I can personalize, but Sherman's books always carries them. Amazon, which booksellers don't like, but if you're desperate, Amazon has them. Maine Coast Bookstore, and I always encourage people to buy locally because, the bookstores are becoming, sadly extinct. So Maine Coast, I spoke there, and they're wonderful. The Sherman's books has several stores.
But you do have some for sale.
I do have some of both books for sale, and I'll personalize them, but they make for great gifts. And well, you've all been a wonderful audience, and thank you. And we'll get you the movie. Yes, the August Gale movie.